Let's continue our discussion on the Civil War today. Our first topic is going to be on the Emancipation Proclamation. Now, doesn't that just roll off the tongue? Emancipation Proclamation. Now, those are fancy words. What it means, emancipation, that comes from a verb to emancipate, which means to free, to release. And proclamation, that means to proclaim, to make a major announcement, to shout it from the rooftops. You're proclaiming it. So when you put it together, it's an announcement of freedom. Now, after the Union troops won at the Battle of Antietam, President Lincoln changed the attitude about the war. So he was the one that issued this Emancipation Proclamation. Now, this proclamation ended slavery, but only in the states that were in rebellion against the Union. So it ended slavery in the Confederate States. And a quote from that proclamation says, "All persons held as slaves within any state in rebellion against the United States shall be then, henceforth, and forever free." So again, Lincoln had a way with words. What he's saying is that any person who is in slavery, and if you are in one of the states rebelling against the U.S., so the Confederate States, you are now free. So the Union changed gears in the war. Before, they had entered the war with the main idea of maintaining the country, that the southern states did not have the right to leave the Union. Now they added a moral issue to the war, that not only were they fighting to maintain the country, they were now fighting to free the slaves. Let's change gears a little bit and talk about the Battle of Gettysburg. Just like in the American Revolution, how the Battle of Saratoga was considered the turning point, the Battle of Gettysburg is considered the turning point in the Civil War, and it happened in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. Now, Union General George Meade and his troops squared off against Confederate General Robert E. Lee. And remember, we talked about that Robert E. Lee was considered a brilliant military mind, and he was a very, very good commander. In a hard-fought battle where both sides lost over 50,000 soldiers, the Union eventually forced the Confederates to retreat. So the Confederates lost after trying several times to charge to break through the Union's line. A few months after the Battle of Gettysburg, many people came there to dedicate a cemetery, to the soldiers who died there. President Lincoln was asked to give a speech. Now, his speech only lasted 2 minutes, but it became one of the most famous speeches in U.S. history. Lincoln emphasized that democracy, a united country, and the end of slavery was worth fighting for. Now let's go ahead and have a listen as the Gettysburg Address is read for us.
Fourscore and 7 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation, or any nation so conceived and so dedicated, can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here, have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living, rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here, dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth.
Very powerful words right there from Abraham Lincoln. Now, that was just out at a website called AmericanRhetoric.com, and that was read by Jeff Daniels. Now, essentially, what Lincoln was saying in that speech is he was dedicating that cemetery. So he was giving honor to the brave men and women who had fought at that battle. And he was saying at the end that yes, they died, but let's not let them die in vain. Let's honor them by carrying out our mission in this Civil War. That they did not die for no purpose. They died so that our country, our republic, could survive, even though we are opposed by the South in this Civil War and facing the moral issue of slavery. So, following the Gettysburg Address, I mentioned that the Battle of Gettysburg was essentially the turning point in the war. So, the Union really took control after that. Now, due to his success in the war, a guy named Ulysses S. Grant was put in charge of the Union forces in 1863. Now, he was successful because he was so aggressive in his battle plans. He knew that the Union had more soldiers and more supplies. So he used that to his advantage. So he could be a little bit more reckless and keep pushing and being aggressive. Now, a major blow to the Confederates happened when Ulysses S. Grant ordered a man named William Tecumseh Sherman to march to the South. Now, what Sherman did is he captured the southern towns of Atlanta, Georgia, and Savannah, Georgia, but basically all along the way as Sherman was marching to and from, they destroyed and burned almost every building and field in their path. So not only were they fighting on in the field against other soldiers, now they were using civilians in warfare. They were affecting towns. They were affecting the way civilians, so non-soldiers, made their money. So basically, he would spread his army out really wide, and all along the path that they would go, they would destroy these towns, destroy these fields, destroy everything in their path. So they had a major crippling effect on the southern states. And that led eventually to the surrender at Appomattox Courthouse. So in the spring of 1865, Lee's Confederate Army was starving and lacking supplies. So we mentioned that the Union had the upper hand, that they had more soldiers and they had more supplies. On the flip side, the Confederate Army did not have those things, so they were starving. Their last chance was to have supplies shipped in. However, the Union cut off those supplies and they surrounded Lee's army. So Robert E. Lee had no choice but to surrender. He was forced to surrender to Grant at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia. And this was the event that ended the Civil War. Now, just because the Civil War was open does not mean that the work was finished. So, 5 days after Lee surrendered to Grant at Appomattox Courthouse, President Lincoln and his wife, Mary, went to view a play. Now, they went to watch a play called Our American Cousin at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. Now, this is probably similar to if you picture you going out for a movie at night. While they were watching, a guy named John Wilkes Booth snuck into the president's balcony seat and assassinated the president. And Lincoln eventually died the following morning. So Booth was a Southern sympathizer. In other words, he supported the South and was not ready to see them lose and not ready to see the Civil War end. Now, Lincoln steered the country through a difficult war, but he was unable to see through his plan for rebuilding the country. So now that the South was considered a part of the United States again, it was a difficult time just getting the country back together, back into one piece, rebuilding the South after the devastation they had. And that leads to our next slide talking about Reconstruction. So, yes, the Civil War ended, but most of the work was just getting underway. The war had destroyed much of the property in the South. It also forced a change of lifestyle for Southerners. Remember, they had relied on agriculture and they relied on slave labor to produce that agriculture. The Union prevailed, but the cost was great. About 620,000 people had died, and about two-thirds of all the wealth in the South was gone. And probably worse is about 1 out of every 10 Southern white men died. So now the country had to rebuild itself, but they had to do so without one of the greatest presidents in history to lead them. Thanks for tuning in. See you next time.